Tonight, the First Lady heads to Eastern Europe, visiting refugees of the war in Ukraine near the conflict zone at the border. Plus,
if the budget isn't keeping pace with inflation, if it's not keeping pace with the demand for real-world assets.
Next year's massive military budget could mean a drop in defense spending due to record-high inflation. And the so-called Ministry of Truth.
I call it the Soviet-style disinformation governance board.
Backlash over the administration's attempt to curb the spread of disinformation. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The First Lady heads to the Ukrainian border, plus new positive job numbers at home. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. Tonight, First Lady Jill Biden is in Romania to support U.S. troops and their families. She'll also visit Slovakia on the border of Ukraine to meet with refugees displaced by the Russian invasion. The trip comes as nearly 6 million refugees have fled Ukraine for neighboring countries. In the besieged city of Mariupol, where Ukrainian forces are refusing to surrender, nearly 200 civilians remain trapped in a steel plant. All of this as reports reveal the extent of U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine, including Russian troop movements and strategic locations. According to the New York Times, that intel leading to the deaths of a dozen Russian generals. Similar reports have surfaced that the U.S. also shared intelligence about the location of a Russian warship which Ukraine sunk in the Black Sea. Here in Washington, the Pentagon has released its budget request for next year, the largest in U.S. history. High inflation rates, though, could drastically cut defense spending. As National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke reports, that could mean a shrinking military.
America's top military leaders agree. The world is quickly becoming more dangerous and unstable. Defense analysts worry that new reality is not reflected in the proposed 2023 defense budget.
If the budget isn't keeping pace with inflation, if it's not keeping pace with the demand for real-world assets and real-world potential combat scenarios, then we're always going to be behind.
President Biden's overall budget proposal includes $813 billion in national defense spending, up $31 billion from the previous year. It was put together, though, before Russia invaded Ukraine, and with an assumption that inflation would drop to about 2.5%. That's considered unlikely, with numbers currently sitting at just over 8%.
So I think that our military establishment has just really lost its way, and there isn't an appreciation for what real war against a peer competitor, where we're operating thousands of miles from home at a disadvantage to whoever the enemy is that's operating at home. And we're seeing these unfortunate realities play out in these budgets and lack of capacity and shrinking of the force.
The Pentagon's mission for the new budget request includes operating under a divest to invest strategy. That means cutting certain programs now to invest in modernization that will hopefully pay off later. The Navy, for example, wants to retire 24 ships, a move that would shrink its fleet to just 280 ships over the next 5 years.
We won't increase the size of the fleet any more than one ship per year for the next 30 years. They won't get to their objective fleet of 355 ships until the year 2050.
Representative Elaine Luria fears that strategy compromises the ability to respond to the threats of today, specifically China. In 2021, Admiral Philip Davidson, the outgoing Indo-Pacific commander, predicted China would be in a strong position to attack Taiwan when the U.S. fleet is now set to be at its weakest.
He testified to the Senate that it's very likely that China could try to take Taiwan by force in the next 6 years, now 5 years. And so the idea that we're going to take a risk and really shrink the size of the Navy during this most vulnerable window is just not acceptable to me.
Last year, Congress was able to step in and boost defense spending. Luria hopes that can happen again.
If you think about, during the Cold War, during the Reagan administration, the defense budget was 5 to 6% of GDP. Right now, we're at about 3.6%. So, based on the threats that we have in the world, really think we need to start, pushing that up. I'd like to see us get to 5% of GDP, which would be, on the order of about $1 trillion.
The Navy isn't the only branch experts worry is headed in the wrong direction. The Air Force is asking Congress to retire 150 aircraft, with plans to add only 82 new planes. And the Army seeks to cut 12,000 soldiers from its ranks. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
On the economy, new positive job numbers. That, though, overshadowed by stocks falling again in a volatile trading day extending Thursday's record sell-off. Jobs are nearing pre-pandemic records, even as the Wall Street roller coaster dips down over fears of the Federal Reserve's continued interest rate hikes to combat inflation. America adding 428,000 jobs in April. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate holding steady at 3.6%, just above the pre-pandemic level of 3.5%. Well, many blame the record inflation partly on the Biden administration's spending. One idea it's now floating, student loan forgiveness. Under changes to federal student loan programs, some 40,000 borrowers would be eligible. President Biden is reportedly considering executive action. One proposal would cancel up to $10,000 in debt for individuals making less than $150,000 and couples making less than $300,000. Republicans oppose the idea, Utah Senator Mitt Romney calling it a bribe for voters. And tonight we are joined by former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Madam Secretary, welcome. It's great to have you with us this evening. So it seems like the president is ready to do something on student loan forgiveness, whatever that might look like. Of course, there's a lot of talk about fairness here, but is this legal? Does the president have the authority to do this, or will it get challenged in court?
Well, Jenna, no, he does not have the authority. It would be an illegal move to cancel student loan debt through executive order. And even the former Obama head legal guy at the Department of Education has opined on this as well. But as you noted, it's also a question of fairness. Who would end up paying for the cancellation of this student loan debt? And it would be the 2 out of 3 Americans that didn't go to college, that didn't take out student loans or student debt, and the others who have paid faithfully on their loans and paid them off. And so this notion that it's just, a wave of the pen and it just goes away is simply a falsehood, and it's an illegal one as well.
Speaking of the coming up November midterm elections, education said to be a major issue for voters. New Fox News polling shows that 55% of Americans support banning teachers from talking about sexual orientation or gender identity before the 4th grade. What have you found on gender identity K through 8?
Well, I think this is a really important discussion to be having. I think the last 2 years have exposed to parents across the country what has been going on in many classrooms, and parents are unhappy, and rightfully so. Parents want their children to learn reading, writing, math, things that are going to prepare them for successful futures, and parents are right to raise their voices in opposition to this kind of culture battle in the classrooms of lower elementary kids. They didn't sign up. Parents didn't sign up to co-parent with the government. And yet that's what in many cases is being imposed on them.
On Title IX is something that you worked on extensively in your time as Education Secretary, the federal education law that prohibits sex-based discrimination. We are awaiting changes from the Biden administration, expected sometime this month. Among the changes, it wants to redefine the word sex in the Title IX to include gender identity. It would also create new protections for LGBTQ students. Secretary, I'd like to get your reaction on that and what these changes might mean specifically for women's sports.
Well, first of all, let me just say we spent a lot of time regulating on this issue of how campuses, schools must handle issues of sexual misconduct under Title IX. And we put forward a rule that is fair, balanced, that recognizes the right to due process, that respects the complainant, the right of the victim to proceed with a case as they want it to proceed. It was a kangaroo court under the previous letter from the Obama administration. And the Biden administration threatens to take that one step further and redefine biological sex to include gender identity and other definitions. This is absolutely wrong. And for when it comes to student or to women's sports, you cannot say I support Title IX and women's access to sports and the ability to compete, and then at the same time say it's okay for transgender students who are men, biological men competing on women's teams. Those cancel each other out, and they're in direct contradiction to one another. And so this is an issue that is going to come face to face with many, as it has in some cases, like at the University of Pennsylvania, and those who are defenders and rightfully so defenders of women's abilities to compete in sports, across the board, should be raising their voices in concern to this move, apparent move to extend the definition of biological sex.
Finally, Madam Secretary, in the time we have left, I'd like to talk to you about free speech. You've teamed up with the Defense of Freedom Institute to join the fight to protect high school football coach Joe Kennedy's right to pray on the field. Tell us about that.
Well, this was a case that thankfully the Supreme Court has taken up since the lower courts didn't see fit to acknowledge Coach Kennedy's right to express his faith in the way that he did following football games, to go and take a knee on the field and say a prayer. He didn't compel anyone else to join him. He made clear they were invited to, but it was an expression of his faith. And taking the logic of the lower court's ruling on this through would suggest that a teacher in a cafeteria couldn't even bow his or her head if they wanted to say a word of thanks before they ate their lunch. And so I'm very hopeful and optimistic that the Supreme Court is going to reaffirm every individual's right to practice their faith, to express their faith. We have the freedom of religion. It's not a freedom from religion.
Yeah. All right, Secretary Betsy DeVos, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jenna.
And coming up, former President Trump and his sway in Republican politics. Next big test after a Trump-backed win in Ohio. Welcome back. The FDA is limiting doses of the Johnson & Johnson single-dose COVID-19 vaccine. The agency says dozens of cases have turned up of a rare but serious blood clotting disorder. 9 deaths in total out of 19 million doses given. Meanwhile, more people are turning to the drug Paxlovid to fight COVID. Clinical trials show the pill cut the risk of hospitalization by about 90%, despite reports of relapses. The news comes as a new vaccine-resistant variant is blamed for an increase in the number of COVID-related hospitalizations. Those hospitalizations up in 35 states. And in New York City, health officials are reportedly considering bringing back mask mandates. On the heels of that leaked draft Supreme Court opinion, lawmakers are scrambling to prepare for the possibility that Roe v. Wade may soon be overturned. The Senate Democrats planning a vote for next week on legislation that would provide the same abortion rights protections to women. It is unlikely to pass, though, in a split 50-50 Senate where they need at least 60 votes. Meanwhile, on the state level, lawmakers are passing legislation that would go into effect immediately if Roe is overturned. In Connecticut, for example, the state's governor is signing a bill protecting women who come for out-of-state procedures. While in Louisiana, lawmakers are pushing forward with legislation that would classify abortion as murder, starting at the moment of conception. And with that, let's bring in Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections. Nathan, welcome. Happy Friday. So we're still 6 months out from the November midterms. Fast forward to then, will we still be talking about abortion then? Is it something that's going to fire up the voters?
Well, first, we need to make sure, right, that the Supreme Court rules as we think it will because of the leaked opinion. But let's assume that the court does rule that way. I think this could be a historic decision that doesn't fundamentally alter the course of these midterm elections. These midterm elections are set up to be very good for Republicans, winning the House, probably winning the Senate as well. And it could fire up the Democratic base. But I don't know. But I don't see this as shifting from being a good Republican year to a good Democratic year. One question or one thing that will be interesting to watch in the future is how Republican candidates answer questions that will inevitably come from this decision. It's going to be the news of the day, so they're going to be asked by reporters. And initially, I think Republicans will say, well, this first of all needs to be done on a larger scale, but also this is a state issue. But as individual states start to enact very stringent laws with some very serious penalties, how will Republicans react, and will they be standing up for those stricter laws if they are running in a competitive state or a competitive district that will require some more moderate voters?
Yeah, former President Trump just won his first big test as a Republican lawmaker. J.D. Vance in Ohio won his primary. Tonight, President Trump will head to Pennsylvania to campaign for Dr. Mehmet Oz. Can Republicans win without the endorsement of President Trump?
Well, it's tough. I mean, you would rather have Trump's endorsement than not. He was certainly influential in the Ohio race where J.D. Vance was probably going to finish third, but it was a very crowded and muddled race, and he helped Trump helped Vance get to first place. In Pennsylvania, Dr. Oz was at risk of losing or trailing Dave McCormick. I think that this puts Oz back in the game, and we'll see if this rally is able to continue to push Oz maybe ahead of McCormick. There are three other candidates in the race: Kathy Barnett, who has been featured on the show, along with Jeff Bartos and Carlos Sands. So I think in these crowded races, Trump's influence, I think, matters more than if it's a one-on-one race where maybe he has endorsed a weaker candidate.
Yeah. Nathan, just a few seconds left here, but Karine Jean-Pierre will make history as the first Black woman and openly gay person to be the next White House press secretary, replacing Jen Psaki later this month. She's also married to a CNN reporter. Is that problematic?
Well, I think it's a valid question. I think it's spouses. It's valid to ask the question. We have to remember that this isn't a job that requires confirmation by Congress. But I know that if we're going to be talking about spouses, that there are some Democrats that want to talk about Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife and cases that could be in play there. So spouses can be a tricky thing when it comes to politics.
All right, Nathan Gonzalez of Inside Elections, thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Jenna.
Welcome back. The Ministry of Truth, that's what critics are calling the Biden administration's new board created to combat disinformation. Its supporters claim it will protect free speech. Many lawmakers and constitutional scholars, though, call it a weapon, and some say its members will be the truth police. CBN's Tara Mergener takes a closer look at the disinformation board and the controversial person chosen to lead it.
The White House defends this government creation, which came quickly after Elon Musk's announcement to buy Twitter. Under the Department of Homeland Security, critics are skeptical of its timing and its mission.
The timing is not coincidental. After Elon Musk pursuing the purchase of Twitter, many on the left are frightened that they are losing an avenue of censorship.
Backlash over what's described as the Democrats' latest attempt to censor speech.
I call it the Soviet-style disinformation governance board.
Democrats think that disinformation is in fact inconvenient to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who will oversee this new government disinformation board, is already pushing back against claims that the group will be the truth police.
This internal working group was established with the explicit goal of ensuring that the protection of free speech, privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties.
Some argue it will do the opposite, and that its leader has his own history of playing fast and loose with the truth.
This is the guy currently presiding over the worst border crisis of our lifetime. He blames the Trump administration for it. At last check, that's a lie.
More than a dozen GOP senators are behind a bill to stop the board, calling its creation an abuse of power, while drawing comparison to George Orwell's Ministry of Truth, which pushed government propaganda in his classic novel about dictatorship, 1984. In defending the idea, the White House has been short on specifics, like who decides what's disinformation and what's not.
I really haven't dug into this exactly. There has been a range of disinfo out there about a range of topics. I mean, including COVID, for example, and also elections and eligibility.
Wednesday, Oklahoma Republican Senator James Lankford also questioned the purpose of the board and the controversial woman who's heading it up.
We don't have a definition of what it is. We don't have boundaries of what it does. The FBI already does this. The State Department already does this. And the person you tap to lead the disinformation campaign has been outspoken on TikTok and Twitter with disinformation.
It's how you hide a little lie. It's how you hide a little lie.
The board's executive director is Nina Jankowicz, who posted this bizarre TikTok of herself singing about disinformation. She calls herself a Russian disinformation expert. Though the White House is promising the board will be nonpartisan, Republicans say Jankowicz has already shown clear bias.
Did it know that she had said that Mr. Hunter Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation?
I was not aware of that.
When the department picked Ms. Jankowicz, did it know that she had vouched for the veracity of the Steele dossier?
I was not aware of that fact.
Meanwhile, the White House insists Jankowicz is highly qualified to take the helm. The board is expected to hold its first meeting within the next several days, while Republicans promise to legislate it out of existence. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Still ahead, teaching kids how to deal with emotional challenges, one book at a time. And finally tonight, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and the number of students dealing with mental health challenges is on the rise. But one Kansas City elementary school teacher may have a solution. Andrea Burns introduced books to her classroom that focus on emotions using a special technique called social and emotional learning, or SEL. The books teach kids how to handle their anxiety and grief in a healthy way. Burns says she noticed substantial improvement in her students' mental health after using the technique. And in fact, she plans to take off a year to focus on her own mental health and write her own SEL book. And that is going to do it for Faith Nation this evening. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening and a great weekend.